Bien, continuamos. La siguiente ponencia, como veis en vuestro programa, es Learning Oriented Assessment by Juliet Wilson. Y os preguntaréis, ¿quién es Juliet Wilson? ¿Verdad? Pues Juliet Wilson is the Director of Assessment at Cambridge English Language Assessment and leads the department which produces the full range of Cambridge English exams. Before that, she was the Director of Network Services, where she was responsible for the management and quality assurance of Cambridge English Distribution Network of exam centres and preparation centres worldwide. Before working for Cambridge, Juliet taught English and trained teachers in the United Kingdom, Colombia, Hong Kong, and Portugal. One of her current interests is the challenge of improving English language teaching and learning for refugees and asylum seekers. Okay, so we welcome Juliet Wilson.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here this evening to talk to you. I apologise that I am going to talk in English. My Spanish is just too horrible, so it's going to be in English. Okay, and today what I'm going to talk to you about is using assessment to support learning. And we're looking at a learning-oriented approach. One of the things I find really interesting is that learning a language is a very natural thing for us to do. We all do it intuitively, we do it in a very engaged way, we don't even notice we're doing it. It's a very engaging process. But what happens when we try to learn our second language, very often this formal teaching turns it into a difficult process, a frustrating process, and a very inefficient process. And we can see by looking at large-scale testing results that after 6, 7, 8 years, students are still not reaching a very proficient level. And assessment, well, assessment's very natural too. It's a natural process. Think about the expression, you can learn through experience. Learn through experience. We do that all the time, whether it's making a cake, learning to play a piece on the piano, whether it's doing a task. We do it, we intuitively look back at what we've done, reflect on it, and try to do it better next time. So once again, that's a very intuitive, engaging process, almost unconscious. So what happens when we get formal testing? It all goes horribly wrong. And formal testing makes us feel anxious, frustrated, doesn't help us learn. So where's this disconnect come? What's happened here? And what we're going to look at today is to try and see if we can have a new vision for assessment and learning and bringing them together in a systemic way. And it's an area that Cambridge English has been working on for several years. We've recently published a book about this, which we can give you more information about. We're looking at it as a systemic system. Can you have a systemic system? A systemic process for joining together learning and assessment. And we're calling it learning-oriented assessment. What I've noticed is if you talk to teachers about learning-oriented assessment, they say to you, oh yeah, we know what that is. That's formative assessment. And I find this quite interesting because what we're doing is we're using formative and summative assessment as the two absolutes in assessment. If you know anything about assessment, you know there's formative that goes on in the classroom and summative that happens at the end of the term or the end of the year. But we're beginning to think that maybe these two very different proposals are actually slightly more blurred. There's slightly more of a grey area between them. And so let's just think about that for a moment. So, an educational researcher called Paul Newton, in 2007, he questioned this, and he said, I don't think formative and summative is a meaningful distinction. let's think a little bit more about the nature of the assessment. So he came up with the idea that formative assessment was actually about a kind of purpose, guiding what happens next, and summative was much more a kind of judgment, evaluating what's happened before. So, is there a difference? Is there really a fundamental difference? I think we could ask the question, can a summative test have a formative purpose? Yes or no? I mean, think about an end-of-term test. Is that summative? Absolutely summative? Or could we use the results of those tests to think about what we're going to teach next class, next term? Could we use the results of those tests to change the curriculum or the learning objectives a bit? How about the driving test, when you learn to drive? Is that summative or formative? Yeah, that's much more summative. I mean, okay, if you fail, you will get some lists of things to improve, and we hope you'll do better next time. But basically, that's more summative. How about a practice test? If you give your students a practice test before an exam? Yeah, it's kind of summative, but it's also formative, because you're going to give them the results, and then you're going to help them to see where they need to improve. So I think really, summative and formative, it's really hard to find absolutes in those. I think most of the time they merge. So let's get rid of the idea that there's formative assessment in the classroom, the light side, and summative assessment, large scale, horrible and bad. I don't think that works. Also, I don't like this picture because that looks like a wall between the two, and we don't want any more walls. We've got Mr. Trump's wall, and that's just enough for this year, I think. Actually, what we're dealing with is classroom assessment, large-scale assessment. It's all part of the same thing if it's focused on the learning. And I think that's a much easier and better distinction, and actually a more accurate one when we think about our classroom practice. Okay, so let's think what Carla said after some research in Hong Kong. So his idea was that for all tests, whether they're predominantly summative or predominantly formative in function, the key aim is to promote student learning. Okay, so this is what we're calling learning-oriented assessment. And Jim Purper in 2004 came up with what I think is probably the best and clearest definition. It involves collection and interpretation of evidence about performance so that judgments can be made about language development. And the aim of all that is to promote learning. So I think we're very interested in this idea of collecting and interpreting evidence and performance to work out what we need to do next. Okay, so the next question then is, how can classroom assessment be really learning-oriented? Now, I want you to be really, really honest with yourselves, just for yourself. After a day at school, which of the statements below are you more likely to think of? Today what I taught was, or today what my student learnt was? Yes. Well, I know that when I was teaching, at the end of 6-8 hours of teaching in a day, I was very focused on what I'd taught. I'd prepared my lesson, I taught my lesson, I marked my lesson, and honestly, sometimes I didn't actually think what the students were learning. I'm sure you're all much better than that, but when we're tired, it's the end of the year, it's very easy to fall into this pattern. Okay, let's think of it round the other way then. Today, what my student learnt was, so you'd look at their performance, you would observe their performance, you would interpret it, and you would work out what you need to do next. And that begins to be a different cycle from prepare, teach, and mark. Okay, but we need to think about these observations and interpretations. How are we going to do this in the classroom? If you want to observe evidence, it has to exist in relationship to something else. You always want to relate it to what's going on. And I think in the classroom we can use previous performance to observe and see what our students are doing. We can think back to our learning goals and objectives and think, what am I observing? Is it actually commensurate with what I thought I was teaching? Of course, we can always use assessment criteria. We can use speaking and writing exemplars. What has your student produced? Is that similar? Is that at the same level? Is that using some of the same structures and vocabulary in language that you were expecting? We can use our friends, the core can-do statements, or the curricula. So there's lots of things when you want to observe evidence in your classroom that you can relate to what you're already doing. Okay, and by doing this, you get a very nice circle here. You set the learners very clear objectives, they perform, you observe, using all those frameworks we just looked at, you interpret, and then you adjust your teaching cycle. And that becomes a nice virtuous circle of feedback and improvement. So, remember what the learning-oriented approach to assessment is collecting, interpreting evidence about performance so that you can make judgments about the next level of language development. And why are we doing this? It's all to promote learning. I'm afraid at this point, the teacher is taking a very back seat, apparently. Okay, so here's a question. Can large-scale assessment be learning-oriented? The Cambridge exams, large-scale assessment, for example. Can we honestly say that these are oriented towards the learner? Well, there we are. We all know about the CEFR and the framework, and we always like to use these can-do statements to try to orient them around our learners. Have a look at these can-do statements and tell me what you think of them. It's a good framework. Do you think it's a good framework? Okay, you're laughing, so you know there's something not very good about my framework. I'm not going to be offended. How about this one? Do you like this one better? Okay, do you like that better? Yeah. Can you explain to yourself or to me why you like that one better? Exactly. There's a theory behind it, there's a progression. And even if we know nothing about mathematics like me, I'd know that that is a progression from easier to more difficult. And so can-do statements in themselves are nothing. They have to be underpinned by some theory of ability. And it doesn't have to be a theory of English ability. In this case, it's clearly a theory of mathematical ability. Okay, and this theory says some elements of maths are easier and some are more difficult. And you're all, I'm sure, absolutely aware of the can-do statements in the CEFR. And if you've taught or have taken a Cambridge English exam, you'll know that the CEFR, the can-do statements, underpin our theory of language ability. And if you know even more about the Cambridge exams, you'll know that that's a socio-cognitive theory of how we learn languages and which areas of language are easier and more difficult. And we know this through lots of observation, through corpora, through expert judgment. And if you're really interested in this, in Cambridge English we've produced 4 books, one about reading, one about writing, one about speaking, and one about listening, that describe the underlying theory of ability of those skills. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because it's a bit late in the evening, but basically this shows you very briefly what the theory of reading looks like in terms of Cambridge English's idea of how to test reading ability. Not going to dwell on it for long. The bit in the middle, the grey bit, that's the bit that goes on in your head, the cognitive processing in reading, the word recognition, the lexical access, the syntactic parsing, etc. On the right is the knowledge you need. What's a word? How does syntax work? What's my knowledge of the world? And on the left is the skills you bring every time you try to read something. You think, am I going to read this very carefully? Am I looking for a bit of information? Do I want to get the general gist? So in a theory of reading, these 3 things all play into each other. Your skills, your knowledge, and the cognitive processing. It's a good theory, it's a good rationale for making a language test, and for example, a reading test in a Cambridge English test will be something like this, where you have different texts, you have to interpret, you have to look at ideas, you have to match what speaker or what writer evaluated each text. So you're having to use not just your knowledge of the world, not just your knowledge of words, but all 3 elements of your theory of reading. And a well-developed test, which really is underpinned by a good theory, is a good thing, and that means that teaching to the test isn't a bad thing. We're always told, oh, if you just teach to the test, that's not good. But if there's a proper underlying theory of ability, then teaching for the test is actually a good thing. Does that make sense? Okay. And of those of you who know of Cambridge English exams, you'll know that we have a range of exams at different levels to meet different needs. And recently, we also introduced the Cambridge Scale, which gives students even more information about their ability in a numerical form. So can-do statements and a numerical score will give plenty of information for candidates and students about their learning and about where they need to improve. Okay, we've looked so far at how classroom-based assessment can be learning-oriented and how actually even large-scale testing can be learning-oriented. Now let's see if we can put the 2 things together. Could you just take a couple of moments to look at these statements? And I want you to think, are these learning-oriented? So the first one, using large-scale assessment for accountability purposes, i.e. the student's performance in the test is used to evaluate and rank the teachers. Number 2 is reporting assessment outcomes in a norm-referenced fashion. That means comparing students with each other. Reporting assessment outcomes as a letter or a number, 82%. Reporting assessment outcomes in terms of grammatical structures that a student has mastered, they've understood, or they've not understood. Could I ask you just to take 2 minutes with the person next to you and decide whether you think these are learning-oriented or not, or somewhere in the middle? Okay, I think that's 2 minutes. How about number 1? Using large-scale assessments to evaluate teachers and rank them. Good teacher, bad teacher. Is that good, learning-oriented? No, that's definitely not. It's shifting the focus right from learning to teaching. So if you're a teacher and you know that you are going to be evaluated on the results of your students, I mean, well, I would do one of 2 things. I would either tell the students the answers. I probably shouldn't say that working for an exam board. Either tell the students the answers or not let the students take the exam if I thought they were going to fail, so that my results looked fantastic. So, no, that's not a good one. How about reporting outcomes, comparing students with each other? Yes or no? So sort of... No, I don't think so, do you? I mean, you're not therefore looking at what an individual student can do. You're just ranking them against other students. And if I was a student and I wanted to come top, I would probably trip up the best student as they came into the exam, or give him something horrible to eat the night before so he wasn't well. I mean, this isn't really about learning, is it? This is just about ranking students from very good to not so good. Reporting assessment as a letter or number. No, not good. No. And reporting in terms of grammatical structures that you've mastered or not mastered. Better or worse than a number? Better. You've got it. Exactly. Anything that you can do a little bit more information for students to help them see where they're going wrong and where they're doing right is obviously going to be more helpful. But obviously not just grammatical structures, but as an example. I think what we need to remember about the theory of learning-oriented assessment is there's definitely a quantitative measure, whether you're A1 or C2, and I guess you can leave that to exam boards because that's what they're very good at. And then there's a qualitative one which talks about the students and about what goes on in the classroom for individual students. And once again, I don't think we need to see these as opposed. They can work very well together. And in a learning-oriented system, they work well together. And they work well like this. You can have an external exam. You can have your learning-oriented assessment syllabus. You can do some summative assessment. You can record your students' achievements. All this can feed into your interpretation of how well they're matching up to the CEFR levels. This can feed into your high-level objectives. And it's just a circle that goes round. So they can work very well together in a learning-oriented classroom. Okay, let's have a think about how this might work in practice in your classroom. So Hattie, in 2009, did some very interesting research looking at how effective certain strategies were for improving learning. And I want you just to take a couple of minutes to think about the impact of these on students' learning. You can rate them from 0, where you think they had no positive impact, to 5, where you think it had a really positive impact. So, for example, if you think students taking frequent tests had a pretty positive impact on their learning, give that a 2.5 or a 3. If you think it had no effect, a 0. And if you think it gave a fantastic effect, give it a 5. Okay, 2 minutes just to talk to the person next to you and try and assess the impact of these. Okay. I'm going to share the ratings with you. And I think you'll find this interesting, because although earlier on I said it's time for the teacher to take a back seat in the world of learning-oriented assessment, in fact it isn't at all, because what are the things that have the best effect on students' learning is formative evaluation by the teachers and the teacher providing this feedback, this very valuable feedback to students. So it's all right, we're still important. And no surprise that what has the least impact on learning for students is just teaching lots of test preparation. Okay, so back to our lovely circle of virtue here. So setting clear objectives, students perform, you observe, you interpret what they observe, you think about the things that will give them really positive effects, so that's formative assessment of them and giving them feedback on their performance. Then you adjust your teaching cycle, you adjust what you're going to do in the next lesson or in the next part of the syllabus or curriculum, and once again you can set objectives. And this is very individualized to students. It's hard work, but it's definitely more rewarding and it definitely has better effects. So, in your classroom, what sort of evidence about student performance could you collect? People often panic and say, I haven't got time to do this. What evidence can I collect? Well, it's there all the time. It's in everything. You can collect it from just listening to them, from homework, from observing them working together. You can collect evidence from tests, if that's what you want. You can collect evidence from their homework, from questions they ask you. The whole classroom is just an absolute rich source of this evidence. And if you think about all this evidence, in your classroom context, could you use any of these things to make learning-oriented assessment a bit more practical? So could you use weekly tests? What about peer assessment? Rather than it always being you doing the assessment, what about the students assessing each other? Online tools. I mean, I don't really like technology, but in the world of learning-oriented assessment, technology is really our friend here. And there's lots of online tools that can teach you more about how to do really good learning-oriented assessment quickly and easily. There's self-assessment. There's writing samples. There's loads of other ideas which can help you to really take on a learning-oriented assessment system in your teaching. So let's go back to the definition. It's not rocket science, it's nothing new, it's what's been going on in classrooms for a long time. But if we bring our focus to it and make it something slightly more systemic, I think we'll see really great results. So that, as Purpura said, learning-oriented approach is collecting, interpreting this evidence, this performance, so that we can make judgments about language development. And the purpose of this assessment is to promote learning, and it's to really measure and interpret what has been learnt. So I think I'll stop there. There's lots more to tell you about learning-oriented assessment. I'm sure in the workshops tomorrow, some of these ideas will come up and we'll have a chance to look at them and discuss them further. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if we have question time.
Thank you very much. Have you got any questions for Juliet?
I'm here tomorrow if they'd rather ask me face to face.
Yeah, that's right. Any questions? No? She will be here doing the workshops tomorrow, so if you have maybe another question tomorrow, yes, maybe face to face you can do it. Okay? Thank you, Juliet. Thank you very much.